History painted them as gods, colossal marble statues, golden laurels, names carved into the bones of cities. But the marble never showed what happened after the crowd left the forum, after the generals were dismissed, after the guards turned their backs. When the doors of the Palatine closed, the emperor was finally alone, and some of them used that darkness in ways that still make historians look away. This is not myth. This is not legend. Every single thing you are about to hear is documented in Roman records, Senate accounts, and the writings of people who lived through it and barely survived to tell it. To understand what happened behind those doors, you first need to understand what the palace actually was. The Palatine Hill, Palladium in Latin, is where we get the very word palace. It stood above Rome, both physically and symbolically. From there, the emperor looked down on 12 million people who depended on his mood. The complex grew for centuries. By the time of Domitian, in the late 1st century AD, it covered an area larger than some modern city districts. Underground passages, secret gardens, private baths that never appeared on any public record. And here's the key thing most people miss. The emperor was not just a politician. He was a living god. The rules that bound every Roman citizen, the laws, the social codes, the moral expectations, did not apply to him. There was no one to say no. No court, no parliament, no press, just power, silence, and whatever the mind invented to fill it. Let's start with the most documented case. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history by his childhood nickname, Caligula, Little Boot. He came to power in 37 AD to genuine celebration. Rome adored him. The Senate called him a gift from the gods. In his first months, he freed political prisoners, burned the secret files of informants, and abolished humiliating taxes. Then something shifted. Historians debate the cause. A serious illness in late 37 AD, the execution of his co-ruler Gemellus, whom he had adopted and then had killed, isolation at the top of an empire with no checks on his behavior. What Suetonius records, and Suetonius was writing within living memory of these events, with access to imperial archives, is a man who constructed an entirely private reality inside the palace. He held banquets that lasted days. He reportedly had a boat built across the Bay of Baiae. 2 miles of ships lashed together, just to ride a horse across it and prove a prophecy wrong. An astrologer had once told him he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the bay. He slept only 3 to 4 hours a night and spent the remaining hours roaming the palace corridors, allegedly calling out to Moon, inviting her to come to bed with him. Historians like Anthony Barrett note that while Suetonius exaggerated for rhetorical effect, the core behaviors are independently corroborated. The sleep disruption, the grandiosity, the dismantling of social reciprocity. What made Caligula genuinely terrifying was not spectacle. It was unpredictability. Senators who laughed at his jokes on Monday were executed on Wednesday for no stated reason. He once forced a father to watch his son's execution, then invited the father to dinner that same evening, and expected him to smile. The Palatine under Caligula was not a court. It was a theater, and everyone in it was performing for their lives. If Caligula was fire, Domitian was ice. The Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, is described by the historian Suetonius in a passage that has puzzled scholars for centuries. He writes that at the beginning of his reign, Domitian would spend hours alone in his private chambers, catching flies, with a stylus, one by one. When an attendant once asked whether anyone was with the emperor, the court official replied, "Not even a fly." This was not madness. It was method. Domitian was, by all administrative accounts, a capable ruler. He reformed the currency, oversaw significant military campaigns, and maintained infrastructure across the empire. But he was consumed by a profound, documented terror of assassination. He lined the walls of the covered walkway where he took his daily exercise with highly polished moonstone, a reflective mineral, so he could see behind him at all times. He slept with a sword under his pillow. He dismissed his bodyguards in private, then rehired them, then dismissed them again. Pliny the Younger, who lived under Domitian's reign and wrote about it afterward, described the atmosphere in Rome as one where people learned to extinguish themselves, to become invisible, to express no opinion, to have no face that the emperor might remember. The palace under Domitian was a place of performed loyalty. Everyone in it was pretending, and the emperor, catching flies in the dark, was pretending too, pretending he was not afraid. He was assassinated in 96 AD. The conspirators included members of his own household staff, people who entered his chamber every single day. Nero is perhaps Rome's most infamous name, but history has layered so much myth over him that the documented reality is actually stranger than the legend. The legend says Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned. The violin would not be invented for another 1,500 years. And Tacitus, our primary source of fire of 64 AD, reports that Nero was actually in Antium when the fire began and returned to Rome to organize relief efforts. What the historical record does give us is something more revealing. A man who desperately wanted to be loved as an artist, not as an emperor, and who used the total privacy of the palace to construct an alternate identity. Nero performed. Constantly, he sang. He played the cithara, a type of lyre. He composed poetry. He acted in theatrical productions. In public, this was problematic. Romans of the senatorial class considered performance arts deeply undignified, the domain of slaves and freedmen. An emperor who performed was an emperor who debased himself. So Nero performed in private. He assembled audiences in the palace, attendees who were not there by choice. Senators, officials, their wives. They were required to watch, required to applaud, required to express genuine admiration. Suetonius records that no one was permitted to leave during a performance, even for emergencies. Women reportedly gave birth in the audience. Men feigned death to be carried out. This is not cruelty in the conventional sense. It is something more disquieting, a profound loneliness, dressed in imperial purple, demanding that the world confirm it was something else. Nero executed his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, in 59 AD, one of the most extensively documented political murders of antiquity. He reportedly inspected her body afterward and, according to Tacitus, made a comment about her physical form. What historians note is that this was not rage. It was detachment. The palace had so completely sealed him from consequence that the acts which would destroy any ordinary person passed through Nero like weather. Of all Rome's emperors, Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 AD, maybe the most difficult for modern historians to assess. He became emperor at approximately 14 years old, elevated by his grandmother Julia Maesa and the Eastern legions. He was, by every account, completely unprepared for power in a way that Rome had not seen before. The Historia Augusta, a source historians treat with caution due to its satirical tendencies, describes behaviors in the palace so extreme that many scholars believe them to be heavily exaggerated for political purposes. But what is documented even in more reliable sources is this. Elagabalus was devoted above all else to the Syrian sun god whose name he bore. He imported the god's sacred stone to Rome, built a temple to it on the Palatine, and reorganized the entire Roman religious calendar around it. He reportedly hosted elaborate private dinners where the dishes served were themed by color, entirely green courses, entirely purple courses, not for taste but for spectacle. Where other emperors built monuments, Elagabalus built performances. He was assassinated at 18 by the Praetorian Guard, alongside his mother. His body was reportedly dragged through the streets of Rome. What makes Elagabalus historically significant is not the scandal. It is what his reign reveals about the system itself. That the palace produced no stabilizing force, no advisor, no institutional voice that could redirect a teenager who had been handed absolute power over 1 million square miles. The palace did not create monsters. It simply gave them nowhere to hide from themselves. The Palatine Hill is open to tourists today. You can walk the same corridors, stand in the rooms where these men ate, slept, and made decisions that shaped the entire Western world. The marble is cracked now. Weeds push through the mosaic floors. The walls that once held absolute silence hold nothing. But here is what stays with me every time I read these accounts. None of these men were born this way. Caligula, as a child, was so beloved by the legions that they made him a tiny soldier's uniform. Nero, as a young emperor, was guided by Seneca, one of the greatest minds of antiquity. Even Domitian spent his early reign attempting, by the records, to govern fairly. What the palace did, what absolute unaccountable power does, is remove every external mirror, every voice that says, this is too far, every face that reflects consequence back at you. And in that silence, whatever was always inside had room to expand until it filled everything. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote, near the end of his life, that he was trying to understand how good men became silent while terrible things happened. He never fully answered his own question. Perhaps the answer is simpler than he thought. When the doors close and there is no one watching, what we do in that darkness is who we actually are. And Rome, for 500 years of empire, kept finding out that the answer was not what the marble promised. If this video reached something in you, subscribe. There are rooms in history that no one talks about, and we are just getting started. Next, the private diaries of Ottoman sultans, and the rituals that even their grand viziers were forbidden to witness.